Today, Prague is known as a tourist destination. It's full of stunning Gothic and Baroque architecture nearly everywhere you look. But at the turn of the 17th century, tucked in amongst this fairy tale setting, a revolution in astronomy was brewing that would shatter the medieval mindset of the cosmos. This story is one of two exiles. The first is Tycho Brahe, forced from Denmark after the death of his patron, Frederick II, after which his successor, Christian IV, withdrew patronage. The second is Johannes Kepler, who came to Prague fleeing religious persecution. Although brief, their collaboration would forever change the history of astronomy. But it was not an easy partnership. While the court of Emperor Rudolf II brought Brahe, Kepler, and others together, each arrived with different goals and ambitions, creating a tangled web of scientific rivalry, political negotiation, and personal tension. In this video, we'll follow their story through the streets, towers, and palaces where it happened to understand how Prague transformed our understanding of the cosmos in the final years of astronomy before the telescope. Prior to the end of the 16th century, Prague was not much of an intellectual hub, as far as astronomy was concerned. Prague University, also known as Charles University, had been founded in 1348 and included astronomy as part of its upper-level courses, but none of the astronomers associated with the university, either as masters or students, are ones you've probably heard of. They included astronomers like Jan Sindel, who was a professor there and became rector in 1410. However, the position apparently didn't pay particularly well, as he was forced to supplement his income by teaching at the Prague City School at St. Nicholas Church. He would later become personal physician and astrologer to King Wenceslas IV. He's known to be the author of a set of astronomical tables, and historians believe that he is the author of the Canons pro eclipsibus solis et lunae per instrumentum ad hoc factum, the canons for eclipses of the sun and moon by means of an instrument made for this purpose. This text discussed calculations and measurements pertaining to eclipses. Ultimately, Jan is most well known for his work on an astronomical clock, which is still attached to the town hall in Prague's Old City and still functions to this day. Associated with this university, we also find Christiannus of Prachatice, who received his master's there in 1390. He's known for his texts on the use of an astrolabe, but because he was a Hussite, his work was not widely distributed in Catholic Europe. When it was, his authorship was frequently removed, leading to his work regularly being misattributed to Robert Anglicus or Prostochimus de Beldomani, despite the text clearly stating it was from Prague. Ultimately, Prague lacked prominent astronomers for one simple reason: the most skilled and famous astronomers sought the most prestigious and wealthy patrons, something which Prague lacked. This would change in 1583 when Rudolf II moved his court and the capital of the Holy Roman Empire from Vienna to Prague. This was done as part of the Czech Compromise. Rudolf needed support from the Bohemian estates to secure his position as Holy Roman Emperor. In exchange, he was required to move his court there and allow for an unprecedented amount of religious freedom. There, Catholics, Hussites, Lutherans, Utraquists, and Jews all lived within the same kingdom. With him, Rudolf brought his interest in astronomy. Quickly, astrologers seeking patronage followed. In 1588, we find Giordano Bruno calling at Rudolf's court. He was evidently lured by promises of easy money that he heard about from his friend Philip Nicodemus Frischlin, who had bragged to Bruno that he was earning a salary of 300 thalers a year from the emperor. Bruno quickly left Wittenberg for Prague to seek patronage. To do so, he first arranged an introduction through the Spanish ambassador, Don Julián de Haro de San Clemente. To encourage San Clemente to make this introduction, he dedicated a book on the Spanish philosopher Raymond Lull to San Clemente. This evidently succeeded, and Bruno then tried the same trick with Rudolf, dedicating a book to him entitled 120 Articles Against Mathematicians and Philosophers. This work lamented the damage that religious wars had done to Europe and expressed Bruno's hope that Rudolf may set things right. While Rudolf received this text and offered Bruno 300 thalers, it was clear that this was a one-time payment. By the fall of that year, Bruno moved on, and by November he was in Tübingen. Another important astronomer in Rudolf's orbit was Tadeas Hajek, a native of Prague. He left to study medicine and astronomy in Vienna, but returned to receive a bachelor's degree in 1550 and a master's degree in 1551. He engaged in further studies in Bologna and Milan, but again returned to Prague in 1558, where he lectured on mathematics and astronomy. In 1572, Emperor Maximilian II appointed him personal physician. But that same year, fate would turn his attention from medicine to astronomy when a new star, now known to be a supernova, lit up the night sky. His focus was also drawn to astronomy in 1577 by the presence of a great comet that year. This interest in astronomy connected Hajek with the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. The two maintained a friendly correspondence. But although Hajek had a strong interest in astronomy, he continued to serve as personal physician for Rudolf II after the death of Maximilian. This left the position of Imperial astronomer open. Beginning in 1591, the position was filled by Nicolaus Reimers, better known as Ursus. Ursus was an interesting choice as he did not receive a formal education. Instead, his talents had been recognized by Heinrich Rantzau in 1574, who had employed him as a geometer until 1584. He then became employed as a private tutor in Pomerania before landing a position in the court of William IV, Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, before he moved to Rudolf's court. The next major astronomer to come to Rudolf's court was Tycho Brahe. Following the death of his royal patron, King Frederick II of Denmark, Brahe was forced to seek new patronage, as Frederick's heir, Christian IV, had little interest in astronomy. Leaving Denmark, Brahe then stayed for a time in Wandsberg Castle as the guest of Heinrich Rantzau while planning his next moves. Fortunately, his friendship with Hajek would pay off, in more ways than one. Because as friendly as Brahe was with Hajek, he was equally unfriendly with Rudolf's imperial astronomer, Ursus. This is because, in 1588, Ursus had published a work entitled Fundamentum Astronomicum, in which he proposed a bold new astronomical hypothesis in which the sun and moon orbited the Earth, but the planets all orbited the sun. If this sounds familiar, it's because Brahe had a similar model, although there were some notable differences. Brahe accused Ursus of stealing his model, and the two became bitter enemies. The two exchanged a series of public attacks in their publications, going so far as to see Brahe attack Ursus's low birth and lack of formal education. Ursus responded, attacking Brahe's disfigured nose and marriage to a commoner. Brahe became so enraged that he intended to pursue legal action against Ursus and wrote to Hajek about the best way to go about doing so. Throughout 1598, Brahe collected his evidence. This included a testimony from Christian Hansen, who had worked for Brahe in Denmark, and affirmed that Brahe had been working on his book, De Mundi Aethieri Recentioribus Phenomenis, which contained his version of the geoheliocentric model by late 1587, prior to Ursus's publication. Hansen also offered testimony that Ursus had visited Brahe and acted suspiciously. Brahe also secured a second testimony regarding Ursus's behavior from Michael Walther, who added further commentary on unusual behavior of Ursus's when he later visited Bygholm Castle, owned by Eric Lang, where Walther was secretary. In September of that same year, Brahe was invited to Prague. He quickly began his journey but could not immediately complete it. He stopped in Magdeburg in October, where he met with Lang, who also affirmed Ursus's strange behavior. With these testimonies in hand, it appears Brahe was confident in his ability to argue against Ursus, as, in January of 1599, Brahe wrote to his former student, Longomontanus, asking if he might be interested in the position that Ursus would be certain to vacate in the very near future. Tycho finally arrived in Prague in June of 1599, and began further legal proceedings, at which point we find Brahe quickly being drawn into the imperial court. Upon his arrival, he and his entourage spent several days in the Belvedere Palace, awaiting an audience with Rudolf. When Brahe finally met with the emperor, the two were quickly enamored with one another. Brahe would later write of the meeting, "He promised to support me and my research, all the while smiling in a most kindly way, so that his whole face beamed with benevolence. I could not take in everything he said because he naturally speaks very softly." Shortly thereafter, Brahe was told that Rudolf was impressed with one of his other inventions, an odometer. Brahe promptly made it the first of several gifts. He would later present a manuscript of the star catalogue he had compiled, ephemerides of the sun and moon that he had prepared in Wittenberg, and an elegantly bound copy of Astronomia and Statura Mechanica. It was clear that Brahe was no longer simply seeking to defeat Ursus in court. Brahe sought to take his position. In July of 1599, Ursus hastily left Prague. It's unclear if this was to flee from Tycho because he and the emperor had a disagreement, or to escape from the plague. He first went to Pilsen and then to Silesia. There, he fell seriously ill. Brahe complained that Ursus may escape justice by dying, but he also realized that this crusade could not be his sole focus, and he returned to observing. That same July, Brahe used a brass azimuth quadrant and sextant to observe the altitude of the Sun and Polaris as they crossed the meridian. On June 22nd, he sent his assistant, Johannes Eriksson, to the top of a tower at Charles University to observe an eclipse. But with the position of Imperial astronomer left vacant, and Brahe having demonstrated his abilities, he was quickly offered the position. The emperor offered him a stunning salary of 3,000 florins, with a down payment of 2,000, more than the royal treasury could pay regularly. Rudolf also offered Brahe a hereditary estate, as well as the possibility of Brahe's family being made nobility. This was important because, although Brahe was born into a noble family, he had married a common woman, which meant that his children were not eligible to inherit his titles. Brahe was also offered the use of one of a few estates, a large hunting castle at Branderis or Lisa na Labem, or a smaller chateau at Benatke na Gizero. Brahe chose the latter, and began moving in August. He quickly started drawing plans for an observatory and alchemical lab. However, while Brahe was allowed to use the chateau, it was still owned by Caspar von Mulstein, who could not afford the renovations, leading to construction stalling. Still, Brahe was evidently able to effect some astronomical modifications. The rabbi, David ben Solomon Gans, visited Brahe 3 times, staying 5 days each time to discuss cosmology and philosophy. He would later describe Brahe's observatory there as a long gallery with a dozen instruments, each in its own room, with roofs that swung open. Still, with a new estate secured, he set up his instruments and began observation necessary to determine the latitude of his new home. In the meantime, some of the assistants that had worked for him in Denmark began returning as well. This included Franz Segnagel, as well as Tycho the Younger and Longomontanus. However, Brahe had not forgotten his fight against Ursus, and continued to collect allies in that fight. The astronomer Johannes Müller sought a position, but could not secure independent funding. Furthermore, there was no longer enough room at Benatke for Brahe's growing staff. As such, Brahe put him up in Prague and had him work on the fight against Ursus. Then, in February of 1600, Brahe discovered another potential ally against Ursus was in Prague and summoned him to Benatke. This was none other than Johannes Kepler, who had been there since January. Kepler had inadvertently waded into the fight between Brahe and Ursus in 1595. Kepler had been attempting to get a better grasp on the connection between planetary distances and the Platonic solids, and borrowed a copy of Ursus's Fundamentum Astronomicum in hopes that it might provide the needed answers. Unfortunately, it did not, but Kepler had believed that Ursus might have more information not contained in the book and wrote a letter seeking insight. Unfortunately for Kepler, he opened his missive with obsequious praise, claiming that everything he knew about astronomy he had learned from Ursus, labeling him the leading astronomer of the age. Ursus initially ignored Kepler's letter because Kepler was not yet important enough to merit a response. But when Kepler's Mysterium Cosmographicum grew in popularity, he finally responded to Kepler in 1597. Further, Ursus sought to capitalize on Kepler's growing reputation, and when Ursus published De Astronomicus Hypothesibus, which attacked Brahe, Ursus included Kepler's letter without his knowledge or consent, thereby drawing Kepler into the conflict. This letter would cause Kepler great embarrassment. His teacher, Michael Meslin, commented, "I cannot believe you wrote such a letter." Kepler, to his credit, recognized the indiscretion, writing in 1600, "Those that know me well will be surprised that I honored Ursus as my teacher instead of Meslin." Shortly thereafter, Kepler and Brahe began corresponding. Brahe asked about the letter, and Kepler admitted the error. He extended a formal apology and offered to write a public judgment of Ursus's new book once he had seen it. Brahe was evidently satisfied with this, but did not immediately offer Kepler a position. Instead, he offered to help Kepler find a position where he was currently living in Graz. Kepler accepted the assistance and returned there. However, Austria was undergoing a counter-reformation, in which Lutherans like Kepler were being forced to deconvert, leave in exile, or pay other fines. Kepler originally left for Hungary, but was allowed to return after a month because the Archduke had an appreciation for his work. Despite Brahe's efforts, Kepler was unable to find employment there after the Lutheran school at which he was teaching was shut down, and he was unwilling to convert to Catholicism. However, his correspondence with Brahe would soon pay off as well. Brahe wrote to him, stating, "You have no doubt already been told that I have most graciously been called here by His Imperial Majesty, and that I have been received in the most friendly and benevolent manner. I wish that you would come here, not forced by the adversity of fate, but rather on your own will and desire for common study." However, unbeknownst to Kepler at that time, Brahe's offer would come with strings. Before Kepler could officially accept Brahe's offer, there were some things that would need to be worked out. Kepler was already in the service of another patron, Baron Hans Friedrich Hoffmann. Brahe wrote to him to suggest the three meet to discuss Brahe making a contract with Kepler. However, while Kepler was still visiting Benetke, Brahe attempted to discuss preliminary terms with Kepler directly, leading to an argument. Kepler got exceptionally drunk and began to rant like a mad dog before storming out and returning to Prague. The next morning, he sent another angry letter before apologizing a few days later. Brahe graciously accepted this apology and assured Kepler that he would attempt to ensure that Kepler could continue to receive his salary from Hoffmann, in addition to what Brahe offered. Kepler accepted these terms and returned to Graz to retrieve his family and belongings. In the meantime, Rudolf, evidently upset with how far away Brahe was, summoned him back to Prague. Brahe initially stayed in a crowded hostel called the Golden Griffin. This residence still exists and is rented as apartments should you visit Prague. The emperor quickly found better accommodations for Brahe, but the location was not suitable for observations. When Brahe's larger instruments and library finally arrived, they were installed at Belvedere Palace, a short walk from Prague Castle, allowing Rudolf to contemplate them at his leisure. However, while this location offered ample space for observation, the hazy city air prevented it. Thus, for the next several months, Brahe set up his press and began printing portions of his Pro-Gymnasmata. Kepler returned to Prague with his family sometime around October of 1600. However, both he and his wife were ill. Still, Brahe quickly set Kepler to work, but not on the project Kepler expected. Instead, Kepler's first assignment was to write the promised response against Ursus. This is despite the fact that right around the time that Kepler arrived in Prague, Ursus died. However, Brahe was not satisfied and sought to use Kepler to tear down Ursus's legacy since he had been denied the desired justice in the courts. Clearly, for Brahe, revenge preceded even science. Kepler wrote to Meslin on the 8th of February 1601, lamenting that, "On account of this illness of mine, I am doing nothing but writing against Ursus." Although Kepler dutifully went about this task, he would not stoop to the invective which Brahe and Ursus had. Instead, he limited himself to a commentary on Ursus's astronomy. One of Ursus's opinions that Kepler attacked was the notion that an astronomical model need not represent reality so long as it was useful in making predictions. Kepler responded, writing, "As in every discipline, so in astronomy also, the things which we teach the reader by drawing conclusions, we teach altogether seriously, not in jest. So we hold whatever is in our conclusions to have been established as true." As Kepler worked on his response to Ursus, Brahe did start giving him astronomical work as well. But, here again, terms and conditions applied. Kepler had agreed to work with Brahe in hopes that he could use Brahe's data to further his own theories. In a letter he wrote to his friend, Hans-Georg Herwarth von Hohenberg, he stated, "Among the most important reasons for visiting Tycho was also that I learned from him more accurate proportions of the eccentricities, with which I might test both my mysterium and the aforementioned harmony of the world. For these a priori speculations ought not to conflict with manifest experience, but ought to be reconciled with it. But Tycho did not confer the multitude of them upon me, except inasmuch as in an aside, while dining, he incidentally mentioned now the apogee of one planet, now the nodes of another. But when he saw I had a daring mind, he decided perhaps the best way to deal with me was to give me my way with the observations of a single planet, namely Mars. I spent my time doing this and was not concerned with the observations of other planets. I hoped every day for a solution of the theory of Mars, after which, I thought, I would also have the other observations." Brahe would have little interest in Kepler's goal. Rather, Brahe sought to refine his geoheliocentric model, proving his version as superior to Ursus's. He assigned Kepler the task of calculating the orbit of Mars, and only provided Kepler with the data necessary for this singular task. Meanwhile, he assigned the lunar model to his longer-serving assistant, Longomontanus. Kepler bristled at being denied access to the full data necessary for his own purposes. He wrote to Meslin, stating, "I rate Tycho in this way. He possesses riches in abundance, of which he does not make the proper use, in the manner of most of the wealthy. Therefore, an effort must be made, which I too have done for my part, but with appropriate discretion, to wrest away that wealth of his, namely, that we beg that he candidly publish his observations, and all of them." Perhaps being aware of Kepler's contrary motives, Brahe was still skeptical of Kepler, possibly due to his earlier faux pas in praising Ursus, as well as his own paranoia that someone else may again steal his ideas. And Tycho had more reason than just Ursus to be suspicious. He had also accused the astronomer Paul Wittich of stealing his intellectual property. Wittich had visited Brahe in Denmark in 1580. There, he taught Brahe a useful mathematical method known as prosthapairesis, which allowed for multiplication or division to be approximated using trigonometry. Brahe was delighted with this mathematical technique and gifted him a copy of Peter Apian's Astronomicum Caesarium, the most elaborate work on astronomy ever printed, and which was accordingly expensive. Wittich later found service as an astronomer for William IV, Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel. There, he reportedly helped oversee improvements to the accuracy of instruments. This was unexpected, since, while Wittich had been visiting Brahe, a small comet had appeared. Brahe invited Wittich to assist in observations, but Wittich declined. It was quickly realized that while Wittich was an excellent mathematician, he was worthless as an observer. He reportedly knew none of the constellations and argued that such knowledge was unnecessary. Furthermore, he was said to have poor eyesight. How then could someone with such limited skills and knowledge have led such an improvement? Brahe assumed that his intellectual property, which he had freely revealed to Wittich, had been stolen. From then on, Brahe was far more secretive about his data and methods, including with his assistant Kepler. As such, Brahe had made Kepler sign a confidentiality agreement on the 5th of April 1600, stating that Kepler would keep everything that the well-informed Herr Tycho has communicated to me, or shall hereafter communicate to me, in whatever manner, most secret. Still, Kepler realized that success with Mars could gain him access to further data, and he continued to work on the orbit, although sometimes without guidance, allowing Kepler a few degrees of freedom. And in these, we can see Kepler already working with ideas that would come to fruition in his later works. For example, Kepler tied the motion of Mars to the true position of the Sun, as opposed to the more mathematically simple mean position. This is important because Kepler is clearly thinking of the physical Sun as the driver of motion, as opposed to the planets simply moving with respect to an intangible point vaguely in proximity to the Sun. On other issues, Brahe and Kepler disagreed on the best approach. Brahe rejected Ptolemy's use of equants, feeling that they betrayed the Aristotelian principle of uniform motion. Instead, he wanted to try to add additional epicycles to account for Mars's irregular motion. Kepler, on the other hand, was already comfortable with non-uniform motion. In a letter to Archduke Ferdinand, he wrote, "I say that nature is exceedingly consonant, that the more a planet gives up its quickness of motion, the further it is from its center, because the observations of the ancients before Ptolemy and of Copernicus, and now Tycho in our time, consistently show that the motor virtue is dispersed from the center into the capacity of the circumference. And thus, the further the virtue departs, the more it is attenuated, since it has been dispersed into a larger orb." This statement foreshadows one of the underlying principles of his laws of planetary motions, in which planets move faster when closer to the Sun and more slowly when further away. Neither liked the approach of the other. Of Brahe's additional epicycles, Kepler wrote, "This seems absurd in natural philosophy, for which reason I resort to my natural causes and non-uniform motions, with Tycho objecting greatly." As Kepler toiled away on the Martian model, Longomontanus completed his revisions to Brahe's lunar model, and, instead of continuing in the shadow of Brahe, sought a position of his own, eventually finding one working for Christian Friis, the Chancellor of Denmark. In 1600, Brahe married his daughter, Lisbeth, to another of his assistants, Tegnagel, and the two left for a year-long stay in Deventer. Yet another of Brahe's assistants, Johannes Eriksson, traveled with them. This was a set of fateful decisions, as it meant that Kepler was the most obvious successor to Brahe, when Brahe fell ill and died on the 24th of October, 1601. To Kepler, Brahe's death was divine guidance. He wrote to Meslin, "I am full of hope, for if God has taken care of me for the better, namely in the matter of exercising my intellect, he will, by all means, also take care of my expenses. And if astronomy is likewise in God's care, as it is devout to believe, I hope I will now accomplish something in it, since I see how faithfully God has joined me to Tycho, such that a way was not open to tear myself away from him, even in the most oppressive circumstances." What Tycho accomplished, he accomplished before the year 97. From that time, his affairs took a turn for the worse, and, distracted by his enormous worries, he himself grew childish. You see how God dispenses his gifts, such that we cannot all do everything. Tycho did as Hipparchus did. It is in the foundation of the edifice that he expended the greatest effort. We cannot all do everything. Hipparchus needed a Ptolemy. With Kepler now appointed as Imperial Astronomer, he would no longer have to worry about funding, and was largely free to define his own research program. However, one task that he would inherit from Brahe was a new set of astronomical tables for Rudolf, which Brahe had proposed to Rudolf mere months before his death. And Kepler recognized the importance of keeping that promise, writing, "This work is of the highest importance, in the respect that Emperor Rudolf justifiably ought to prize it most highly, because more people remember King Alfonso today on account of the Alphonsine tables, however faulty they might be, than on account of his wars and exploits, of which memory is lost in time." When Brahe proposed this new set of tables, he of course intended for it to be constructed using his geoheliocentric model. However, Kepler had no faith in this model and was a staunch Copernican who believed in a pure heliocentric model. Thus, while Kepler would adopt the task of creating a new set of tables, they would be drawn up on his terms. Accordingly, Kepler's first goal was to revise the Copernican model to better account for the discrepancies that Brahe's data would be able to reveal and, he hoped, correct. The only trouble was that Kepler was not to inherit Brahe's instruments or his much-needed data. Instead, these would be inherited by Brahe's family, who were well aware of their value. And not only did they know how badly the data was needed, but they also understood that Kepler had no intention of continuing to work on Brahe's geoheliocentric model. Instead, they rightly feared that Kepler would use the data to overthrow Brahe's legacy, which would, in turn, devalue anything that remained in their possession. As such, the family initially asked for a sum of 100,000 florins, an absurd amount. Rudolf countered with an offer of only 20,000, which was still sufficient to buy 6 estates in Bohemia, and equal to a century of Kepler's previous salary from when he worked in Graz. Reluctantly, Brahe's family accepted, but there was one small problem. Rudolf had stipulated that the funds should come from the royal coffers instead of his personal account, and the royal coffers did not have the sufficient funds. To help smooth things over, Rudolf conceded to pay in installments with a 6% annual interest until the debt was paid, retroactive to the date of Brahe's death. However, Kepler had not waited until a deal was reached to seize control of the instruments and the data. In a letter to Christopher Hayden, he wrote, "I do not deny that upon Tycho's death, because of either the absence or insufficient expertise of the heirs, I boldly and perhaps arrogantly took charge of the observations he left behind, against the will of the heirs, but nevertheless according to the not obscure command of the Emperor. Since he had entrusted the care of the instruments to me, I interpreted the mandate broadly, and took especially the observations to care for." Fortunately, there was little objection, until Tegnagel returned to Prague in the summer of 1602, at which point he realized that the promised funds had not been paid at all. Brahe's family sought the return of the property and made it clear that there would be other interested parties if Rudolf did not pay. Kepler refused to hand the instruments over, prompting Tegnagel to sue for them. Furthermore, Tegnagel decided to take over some of Brahe's other unfinished works, namely the printing of his Progymnasmata. Tegnagel rushed this to print, including an index for the work that Kepler had written but did not receive credit. But, in his haste, the volume was poorly edited. By October of 1602, some of the promised payment had started to arrive. But Tegnagel had realized that he may be able to profit even more by taking over control of the production of the Rudolphine tables. Kepler complained to von Hohenberg about this, writing, "Tegnagel is obtruding himself in anticipation of the Rudolphine tables. Perhaps his affairs in Westphalia are such that he has need of this support. Nevertheless, I am concerned by the precedent. In order to excuse his purpose, or to veil his true reason, poverty, he pretends to the courtiers that he is concerned with the honor of his parent or father-in-law, that he fears that the studies that have been undertaken are being carried out very clearly against Brahe's intention, and that he knows how Brahe wanted it done. These things have the appearance of truth, because both previously and while Tycho lived, and was conscious of it, I followed Copernicus's hypothesis, and thus, as far as I can see, there will be either something to be defended contrary to what I believe in philosophy, or something that disagrees with Tegnagel. The former I have never done, and will not do in the future. The latter I would do in such a way that I speak of disagreement, not of hatred. Whether he would act the same, I do not know." That month, the lawsuit concluded, in favor of Brahe's heirs. With control over the data, Tegnagel was also given control of the work on the Rudolphine tables. With his main purpose as Imperial astronomer stolen from him, Kepler found himself in the awkward position of having to justify why he should have the position at all. He quickly reviewed what projects he could complete with what he had available to him, and that he could use to justify his continued employment to Rudolf. He explained his decision in a letter to von Hohenberg. "Because I have had my diligence called into doubt, I have assumed the obligation for 2 works. The one to be ready for Easter, 1603, will be Commentaries on the Theory of Mars, or whatever else the name might be, or The Key to a Universal Astronomy. The other, to be finished off within 8 weeks, is the optical part of astronomy." Although it was not yet apparent, both of these works would be among the most important scientific texts ever written. As promised, Kepler completed the optical part of astronomy first, although it was not ready by the Easter deadline he had originally set. Perhaps part of the reason for the delay was that Tadeas was not as capable of an astronomer as he imagined himself to be when he proposed to take over the project. He needed Kepler's help, and Kepler sought to make him pay for it. He demanded 1,000 of the 4,000 florins which Tadeas had received so far from Rudolf, plus joint authorship. Tadeas refused. Kepler returned to his work on the optical part of astronomy, which went to print in 1604. This work focused on how the eye might be tricked into making false observations when conducting astronomical observations. It was inspired by a problem that he and Brahe had been discussing even before Kepler had come to Prague. Specifically, using a camera obscura to view solar eclipses had become a common practice. Yet the observations from this instrument contradicted other observations of the relative size of the Sun and Moon. In particular, the Sun appeared too large and the shadow of the Moon too small as it intruded on the image of the Sun. Brahe's belief had been that this had something to do with the size of the aperture of the camera. Kepler had been studying this and had, in fact, observed a partial solar eclipse on the 10th of July 1600 before he left Graz, using a camera obscura, and taken detailed notes. From these, he was able to confirm Brahe's hypothesis and demonstrated that the size of the aperture would cause the edge of the bright Sun to blur and intrude on the Moon's shadow, thus expanding the apparent size of the Sun and diminishing the apparent size of the Moon. Kepler also realized that the eye should function as a camera obscura, projecting an image of the world upside down on the retina. However, he did not question why we perceive the image upright still. That, he said, was a question for physicians, not astronomers. Yet, Kepler still explored other aspects of the eye and correctly explained the cause of myopia. Lastly, he explored the issue of atmospheric refraction. In this, he evidently had some access to Brahe's data, as he discussed an observation of Venus in which the planet appeared to hang just over the horizon for a full 15 minutes, despite the calculated position of the planet being a full 2 degrees below the horizon by the time it finally appeared to set. He also cited an example from Meslin, in which refraction during an eclipse was observed to be more than 1 degree. From this, Kepler realized that refraction was responsible for the squashed appearance of the Sun at sunset, making him the first to put this observation into writing. However, his model for refraction was ultimately incorrect due to him taking an Aristotelian assumption, in which the atmosphere abruptly terminated at some distance. This work was also the first clear articulation of the inverse square law of light. Although it had some problems, this work is considered the father of modern optics. Kepler's other work, the Commentaries on the Theory of Mars, would also be severely delayed. In 1604, Kepler finally came to an agreement with Tadeas to assist him with the Rudolphine tables. Their agreement stipulated that Kepler would have full access to all of Brahe's observations, and, in exchange, Tadeas would be able to use anything Kepler derived from them, so long as Kepler received credit and the work was unaltered. Kepler would also be required to consult with Tadeas on any changes he made to the tables. The contract would be valid until the publication of the Rudolphine tables, which they agreed to complete in 4 years. However, this estimate would also prove overly optimistic. This was in part because Kepler still intended to create a new version of the heliocentric model on which to compute the tables. Thus, instead of simply developing commentaries on the theory of Mars, he would need to develop complete models for all of the planets. Again, writing to von Hohenberg, "I have beheld the sun in the theory of Mars as though in a mirror, in that I see how and to what extent it affects all planets. Truly, from Mars, I take the example for treating the others, and thus I hope presently for all the best for every part of astronomy." But, due to the agreement with Tegnagel, he knew that any work he did on this would be subject to review. Thus, he had to walk a fine line between progressing on his work on one side and appearing to use Brahe's work to overshadow him on the other. Furthermore, Kepler fell gravely ill in 1604, so much so that he feared he would not live to complete the work. He wrote to the University of Tübingen, begging them to publish his yet unfinished work if he should die, which he hoped would be free from review by Tegnagel, as it would technically be Tübingen publishing it instead of Kepler. His letter read, "I do not yet see an opportunity to publish, for I have come to an agreement with the noble Lord Franz Tegnagel, His Holy Imperial Majesty's Counselor of Bohemian Appeals in his capacity as the late Tycho Brahe's son-in-law, that he will share the Brahean observations with me henceforth, for he keeps possession of them until the heirs receive another 16,000 florins from the Emperor. But I am obliged to publish nothing without his consent before he himself completes the Rudolphine tables, for which he is slowly preparing himself." And there is the danger that, just as there has repeatedly been contention with him up to now, so will it be also in the future, while he looks out for his father-in-law's honor and I for my philosophical freedom. In this case, faith in my discoveries compels me to take the precaution of depositing a copy of the commentaries with my paternal academy, which would attend to their publication if it should befall me to die. Tübingen realized the precarious legal situation this could put them in and declined, responding that they would only publish what could be done without offense to His Holy Imperial Majesty. In response, Kepler asked von Hohenberg to circulate handwritten manuscripts which would not technically be published. Fortunately, Kepler survived his illness and continued his work, with occasional side projects getting in the way. On the 9th of October, 1604, a new star was sighted in the constellation of Serpens, and it was reportedly as bright as Jupiter. The first recorded observation was by Lodovico delle Colombe in Italy. Kepler didn't begin observations of it until the 17th of October. Although Kepler was somewhat late in observing it, he was able to track this guest star for a full year. He regularly checked its position by measuring its distance from other nearby stars. His observations were incredibly accurate, even without the use of Brahe's instruments, from which he concluded that there was no movement. He published his findings in a work entitled De Stella Nova in Pede Serpentari in 1606. This supernova is now known as Kepler's supernova and is the last supernova seen in the Milky Way. Kepler also observed a solar eclipse on the 12th of October, 1605. During the eclipse, Kepler was able to observe the ghostly image of the solar corona, which he incorrectly interpreted as sunlight scattering through the atmosphere of the moon. As discussed previously, camera obscura were used for solar observations, and in May of 1607, Kepler noticed a small spot on the disk of the sun. Because he knew Mercury was near conjunction, he incorrectly assumed that this was Mercury transiting the sun. In reality, Mercury was on the far side of the sun and wasn't in conjunction until the 1st of June. Rather, what Kepler observed was a sunspot. When, in 1610, sunspots were discovered as features on the sun itself via telescopic observations, Kepler admitted his mistake, stating, "Lucky I, who was first in this century to have observed the spots." But throughout all of this, Kepler continued to work on his expanded commentaries on the theory of Mars. It was finally published in 1609. By that time, Kepler had fully developed several novel ideas in the astronomical models he presented. Accordingly, the work was given a new title, Astronomia Nova, the New Astronomy. It would prove to be Kepler's most important work. In this work, Kepler was not content to simply make another model that could mimic the motion of the heavens. He wanted to develop and explore the principles that governed motion. Like Copernicus, Kepler had found it suspicious that certain motions of the planets all seemed to be performed in specific positions with relation to the Sun. Thus, Kepler sought not only to make the Sun the center of all things, but the reason for all motion, imbuing the Sun with a force that drove the planets in their orbits. This was why Kepler had been interested in the true position of the Sun in his work on Mars for Brahe, as opposed to its mean position used by Ptolemy and Copernicus. In this work, Kepler began shifting to what sounds almost like a modern concept of physics. He wondered about the nature of these forces and proposed magnetism as a solution. Kepler also had religious reasons for his centrality of the Sun. He tied the structure of the cosmos to his Trinitarian belief, associating the Sun with God, the Father, the fixed stars as the Son, Jesus, and the heavens or the intermediate aether as the Holy Spirit. He believed that the motion of the aether and the stars was all driven from the body of the Father in the Sun. Another innovation of Kepler's was abandoning the circular orbits that had been assumed since antiquity. This was a realization that he came to only shortly after Brahe's death. In particular, he kept finding that, using circles, the motion of Mars was too fast when at conjunction and opposition, and too slow at quadrature. Shortening the distances it needed to travel by squishing the circle inwards and forming an oval meant it could achieve greater speed over those intervals as compared to syzygies. As Kepler refined his thoughts on these issues, he came to two realizations that we would now call the first two of Kepler's three laws. Planets move in elliptical orbits with the Sun at one focus, and the planet's speed changes such that they always sweep out equal areas in equal intervals of time. Calculations took several years. An unfinished version was presented to Rudolf in 1604, but Kepler informed the emperor it would not be complete until at least August of 1605, but the manuscript was finished around 1605 or 1606. In it, Kepler does not simply present his own theory. Instead, he begins by comparing the three most popular theories of the day, those of Ptolemy, Copernicus, and Brahe. He then compared and contrasted them before presenting his own. But despite having the work ready to print, it would still take a few more years to do so. First, Kepler would need the funds from Rudolf, which had not been forthcoming. As time dragged on, Kepler asked the emperor to be allowed to pursue another patron to fund the printing. Evidently, this spurred Rudolf to action, as in December of 1606, he ordered that Kepler be given 400 florins to print his work. This was only half of what Kepler had requested, and the funds were not actually released to Kepler until the 28th of March, 1607. The emperor would not allow Kepler to seek another patron and reserve the right of distribution to himself. The remainder of 1607 was spent preparing the woodblocks used for illustrations. However, Kepler had another hurdle. The Rudolphine tables were never completed, which meant that Kepler would need to seek permission from Tagnagel to publish. Kepler's first hope was that, because he and Tagnagel had agreed that the table should be completed in 4 years, and more time than that had passed, the agreement might be considered void. Additionally, he hoped that, if it came to it, he could argue that Tagnagel had abandoned the project. He laid out his argument to Johann Pistorius. "I do not yet have permission from Tagnagel to publish. Tagnagel finally seems to have given up hope of the Rudolphine tables. I will not while I am still alive. If Tagnagel prevents me from divulging anything because of our contracts, I will expressly state that I have been deceived, since he himself promised to do the Rudolphine tables within 4 years." Although ill-disposed towards this promise which was made to the emperor, I promised to wait until those tables appeared, after which my philosophical freedom would remain intact. Now he will never write any tables, therefore our contracts are invalid if they do not include the 4-year condition. It will be sufficient that those 4 years were specified aloud to the emperor. To further his position, Kepler also secured an order from the emperor that the work should be published. Ultimately, Tagnagel was allowed to make adjustments, but was offered almost no time to do so. With other obligations taking his time, Tagnagel was only able to offer a short preface to the work. In it, he cautioned the reader that Kepler had taken liberty in certain matters, but especially in his disagreeing with Brahe in physical argumentations, and hastened to remind that while this new theory may be Kepler's, that he has constructed it upon Brahe's foundation, and that all materials, observations that is, were amassed from the labor of Brahe. Astronomia Nova would not be Kepler's last work. His third law, that the square of a planet's period is proportional to the cube of its distance to the Sun, would come in his 1619 Harmonices Mundi. The Rudolphine tables even made it to publication in 1627. And there were many other works by Kepler as well. Although it took time, Tegnagel's fears that Kepler would overthrow Brahe's legacy did come true, as Keplerian astronomy, enhanced with Newtonian physics and Einstein's relativity, form the foundation for modern astronomy. Similarly, Rudolf was forced to abdicate in 1611, replaced by his brother Matthias. He died shortly thereafter on the 20th of January, 1612. Rudolf's collection of scientific instruments and curiosities was dispersed after his death. Many of Brahe's instruments were placed in the garden and arcades at Belvedere Palace. A portion of his collection of books was donated to the Jesuit University in Prague. And it was in Prague that the patronage of an emperor fascinated by the heavens brought together the necessary individuals to transform astronomy. As Kepler had boasted, he became the Ptolemy to Brahe's Hipparchus, creating a fully new astronomy. Kepler's Astronomia Nova was published in 1609, the same year Galileo first used a telescope. Thus, the partnership forged in Prague marked the end of the medieval mindset of astronomy, at the very end of Astronomy Before the Telescope. Hi everyone, thanks for watching. This video was not one that I'd originally planned to do nearly so soon. However, this past March, I was in Germany for a conference, and my wife suggested visiting Prague for a few days. Suddenly, research for this video took priority over the several others I have lined up. I hope I did the legacies of Brahe and Kepler justice, as this was one of my longer videos, and accordingly, there was a lot of material to go through. If you're interested in seeing my full notes and a list of references, you can find those over on my Patreon. I'll also be including a map of the locations that I've mentioned in this video, as well as others related to Brahe's and Kepler's time there that I couldn't work into the script. But if that's more than you're looking for, thanks for watching anyway, and I'll see you next time on Astronomy Before the Telescope.